we touched on the fact that technology shapes the character of these formations, that it's changed in the 20th century from what it used to be. And another thing I would highlight here is, aspiring totalitarians typically do two things first. They try to take over the media and they try to take over the money. And I think this is words and prices, if you will, as the coordinating mechanisms of a society. Maybe those are perhaps the primary ingredients of that symbolic structure you described, right? You need to be able to control the media narrative and control the flow of capital, basically, to construct these symbolic structures. Do you think the present upheaval we're seeing in the world is because there's been this tectonic shift in the media and money landscape? Like we've gone from top-down media, 20th century media model to this many-to-many digital media model, right? Which we're engaging in now with this podcast, and there's the intellectual dark web. There's all these other sources of information, I guess, where people can escape that top-down model and go into more of a peer-to-peer model. And we see something similar in money too, that people now can leave fiat currency and go into a money that nobody can print, like Bitcoin. Is part of this upheaval then I hate to use the word elites, but the people that are in power in the old media paradigm, are they now scrambling to get in a position of power in the new media and money paradigm? Is that the turbulence, or a contributor to the turbulence we're seeing in the world?
I don't know. It seems that it's the first time that I take this perspective that you mentioned there, because it's interesting. On the one hand, indeed, we see how the symbolic power, the power to create the narratives that guide society, that structure society, becomes more and more concentrated in less and less hands. And so there's a very limited amount of people that dominates the mass media, I think, on the one hand. But indeed, at the same time, also the opposite process happens in society, where more and more people through the mass media can communicate, can bring their own narrative and distribute it in the social space. That's also true. There are these two processes happen parallel to each other, and we probably will see a kind of a polarization between the two. We see indeed how this limited set of people, that, for instance, the people who disseminated the corona narrative, we see how these people use more and more utter censorship to control the stream of information on the social media, for instance. We've all noticed that, how certain posts were censored, how people were blocked, how people were removed from LinkedIn, and so on. So we see indeed, we see something like a kind of a polarization between, on the one hand, the ever more limited and small group of people who possess or who own the mass media, who control the mainstream media, and then the ever-growing number of people who express their opinion and who distribute their own narratives through podcasts, social media, and so on. Yes, that are two very interesting processes that happen parallel to each other. I think, well, in the end, I think it's extremely important to realize that in emerging totalitarianism, the most fundamental factor is never the elite. It's something very important, I think. In this respect, that in a classical dictatorship, the point of gravity of the system is always situated in the elite. It's the dictatorial regime that is the most important factor in a dictatorship. And if you destroy a substantial part of the dictatorial regime, then you will see that usually the system will collapse. In a totalitarian system, this isn't true. If in a totalitarian system, a part of the totalitarian elite is destroyed, it's usually replaced and the system continues as if nothing happened. That's exactly why Stalin knew that he could eliminate, liquidate 60% of his Communist Party members, that the system, that they would just be replaced and that the system would continue. The point of gravity is rather situated in a totalitarian system in the mass, so in this part of the population which fanatically believes in a narrative and which is in the grip of a certain ideology, and which will endlessly put forward and deliver new people who can replace that part of the elite that is eliminated. And even more fundamental than the elite and the masses is the ideology. That's the point. So we should situate the ultimate enemy, the root cause of totalitarianism at the level of a certain view on man and the world, a certain ideology. In the Soviet Union, that was historical materialism of Marx. In Nazi Germany, the ideology was a certain race theory. Now, in this crisis, I think, or in our epoch, what the ideology is transhumanism or a certain technocratic ideology. And all these, in the end, there is only one basic ideology. It's the fundamental view on man and the world, which is typical for Western culture as it emerged starting from the 16th century onwards. And that is the so-called mechanist view on man and the world. That's the ultimate cause of the phenomenon of totalitarianism, whether we are talking about the Soviet Union or of Nazi Germany or the kind of system that is emerging now, which is not a fascist totalitarianism or not a communist totalitarianism. What we are seeing now is the emergence of a technocratic totalitarianism, a totalitarianism led by experts, bureaucrats and technocrats, not by gang leaders such as Stalin and Hitler, to use the words of Hannah Arendt. So but every time the ultimate ideological ground on which totalitarianism flourishes is always mechanist ideology. That means a kind of view on man and the world, which believes that the entire universe is a dead machine, a set of elementary particles, molecules, atoms that all interact with each other according to the laws of mechanics, and most important, that can perfectly be described, controlled, and manipulated in a rational way. So human rational understanding is believed to have the capacity to understand everything, explain everything, control everything, and to be the guiding force in society. So that's the illusion, I think, on which mechanist materialist ideology is based, and it is that ideology, that is exactly what I explain in my book. It's that ideology that creates, through a series of steps, one, this social disconnectedness, this disconnection between individuals and their social and natural environment. And also, it's this ideology, this way of thinking, that creates these conditions in the population that are necessary for mass formation. And it's also this ideology that created a new elite that uses or that believes that propaganda and indoctrination are the foremost instruments to control the population, to lead the population, and to organize and structure society. So that's our two parallel processes. On the one hand, throughout the last few hundred years, we have seen the emergence of mass formation that continued longer and longer, that lasted longer and longer, and that became more and more powerful just because the conditions for mass formation were more and more fulfilled. There was more and more loneliness as a consequence of this mechanistic thinking, this mechanist view on man and the world. And on the other hand, so on the one hand, this mechanist ideology created the conditions that led to mass formation in the population, and on the other hand, it created a new elite with different characteristics than, for instance, the religious elite of ancient times, with different characteristics, with different tools to control the population, with a different way of thinking, with a different ethical and moral norms and so on. And it is this, yeah, as Hannah Arendt said, this diabolic pact between this new elite, this mechanist elite, and this new population, this new mass, this new crowd, that time and time again leads to the emergence of totalitarian systems. So totalitarian systems, very important, did not exist before the 20th century. They emerged for the first time in the 20th century. Before the 20th century, there was no such thing as totalitarianism. Before the 20th century, there were classical dictatorships, there were tyrannies, but there was no totalitarian systems. And this was simply because before the 20th century, the masses were not large enough, they didn't last long enough, and the elite didn't have mass media at its disposal to manipulate the masses. So, and these things changed together, and in the 20th century, both the elite and the population were ready for very long-term mass formation, in which the masses could control the state machinery and could create a new kind of totalitarian state, a state which doesn't only control public space and political space, such as a classical dictatorship does, but which also controls private space. And that's why, because the totalitarian state has a huge secret police, which is this part of the population that fanatically believes in the state narrative and that is always willing to snitch and report everyone, also in his own family, who doesn't go along with the state narrative. So that's why a totalitarian state has this a much more suffocating impact on the population compared to classical dictatorship.
Yeah, it's a great point. I'm reminded of that Ron Paul quote that it's no coincidence that the 20th century was the century of total war and the century of central banking. And I guess we could add to that also the century of totalitarianism. There seems to be some connection, right? And maybe this whole idea, these attempts to control people also seem to resonate from a materialist paradigm, right? It's where it's almost like a flawed metaphysics, perhaps even, that the idea that you can move people around like chess pieces on a chessboard, and that there's no imperfect information, right? There's no unforeseen consequences or unintended consequences. But that entire paradigm fails to observe the self-organization we see in nature, right? The flock of starlings doesn't have a little tyrant telling them what to do. They're entirely self-organized on simple rules. So you don't need, like, this idea that we need to be managed or we need to be tyrannized to make society work. It's just, it just totally doesn't hold up to, I guess, complexity theory. So maybe we're still dealing with the detritus from Newtonian physics, where we think everything's a clockwork universe. But now, obviously today we know it's much more. We know the limits of knowledge, basically, and your book goes into that deeply, where if you follow science far enough, you realize that science can only take you so far, basically. And all of this, so all these attempts then to control people coming from a materialist paradigm, also built on the hubris that humans are even capable of constructing a utopia. I mean, that always seems to be the false promise in these ideologies, is just do this thing and we'll get to the promised land, or we'll get to the Marxist utopia, whatever it may be. But all of that fails to account for just the natural complexity of human affairs, right? That we are a complex, dynamical system that cannot be managed any more than the weather can be managed, right? Although I think there are attempts being made at that now as well.